Hi Maine Fiddle Campers, I'm Liz Faiella. Many of you might know me from past fiddle camps, but if you don't, I am from New Hampshire and Maine is nice enough to let me come hang out up there every now and again with all the really cool musicians up there, like you guys. And so today I'm going to be doing a workshop called Session Obsession, and it is about Irish sessions particularly. And I'm going to cover a few different things. We're going to talk a little bit about how you approach learning a tune in a session context or in a slow session style. And then also just a few things about Irish sessions in general, etiquette, sort of what to expect if you go to an Irish session. Many of you have probably been and might have been a little bit turned around or even turned off if it was like a little bit of a grumpy session where people didn't really necessarily weren't the most welcoming. So that can happen, but maybe you've had some great Irish session experiences. But regardless, we're just going to talk a little bit about all the different elements of Irish sessions, and we're going to start out actually though by talking about how you pick up a tune in a session setting. So not every session is the most welcoming to this. You kind of have to gauge the room a little bit, but in my experience I've actually learned a lot of tunes in sessions. I just by sort of very cautiously noodling along with tunes and eventually grabbing little phrases and expanding those a little bit. So here's the tune that we're going to start out with. It's called Miss Galvin's, and it's just a lovely little reel, sometimes played as a hornpipe. I'm going to play it as sort of a slow reel, and I'll play it a few times so that you get a sense of what it would sound like in a session. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how you would pick it up if you were listening to it. So here's how it goes. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that is the tune. Let's start out just by talking about, like, when you first hear a tune, what are the first things you can do to make it easiest for you to learn the tune by ear? One of the key things for me is finding the key. So you want to figure out, unless somebody tells you like, it's in D, which usually they're not going to do necessarily, and you don't necessarily want to bug people for that. What I will do is I will sort of noodle around a little bit, just looking for the bass note while I listen to the tune. So you can usually hear it if you kind of just try a few different things. Trial and error is going to be a big theme today, but if you try a couple of different notes just really quietly while the tune is playing. So let's try that. 1, 2, 3, 4. lock into place. And this is where it's really useful then to know your scales and arpeggios. I hate to say this to a fiddle-oriented group, but yeah, scales and arpeggios are great because if now you know this is in D, here's that bass note, D, and you know a D scale, you know where your fingers are going to be placed. Or for any melody instrument, you know what the notes are in that scale. So it eliminates all the notes that aren't in that scale. And so then you can start listening and you can really listen for where the stepwise motion is in the tune. So for example, you might be listening along to the tune and hear so right there, that's like a little part of a scale. And it's usually easiest to hear the parts that are kind of like a scale if you've been playing scales before. So if you've been playing your scales, your fingers are more ready to kind of find that. Stepwise motion in general, notes that are just right next to each other are usually the easiest phrases to get. So let's play through this tune, listen through this tune, and I'm just gonna play the parts that have scales in them so you can hear where those are, and then you can kind of latch onto those phrases. You can be like, okay, well, at least I've got this part of the tune. 1, 2, 3, 4. There you go. So you might have to listen to the tune a couple times to really hear those parts, but you've got a few parts where you got a scale. The other thing that's helpful is if you know your arpeggios, because very often, even if you're not hearing a full-on arpeggio, you might hear parts of an arpeggio, and usually what's trickiest to get when you're listening to a tune, the stepwise motion is the easiest, but the skips are the harder part. So if you know what an arpeggio sounds like, chances are there's going to be something that sounds a little bit like a D arpeggio in the tune. So arpeggios are the first, third, and fifth note of a scale. So in this tune, you have this part of the tune. That little repeated phrase that's a little bit arpeggio-ish. So it includes that first, and then the fifth, and then the third, and back to the fifth note of the scale. So it's notes from the arpeggio. You're more likely to be able to hear that if you've been playing your arpeggios. So let's play through this and see if we can get the arpeggio parts and then also the scales. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're getting a little bit more of the tune now. So one of the things that I like to do once I've got a few phrases is I look for then some repeated phrases, things that kind of keep coming back in the tune. The nice thing about a lot of fiddle tunes is that you've got a ton of repetition. Often it's sort of a structure of theme and then an answer to that theme. then back to the first theme, and then a different answer to that theme. So the nice thing is, if you get the first theme, chances are it's gonna come back later in the tune. So the first thing we hear in this tune is that little run. So we can kind of hear that and we can say, okay, if that's the first thing we hear, that's maybe the initial theme, might come up again later in the tune. Okay, so we've got that A part theme that comes back again. Now let's think about the B part. And if we're listening to the tune, it starts out with this theme in the B part. So now that we know themes, the first theme of a part tends to come back, we can listen and see if that's going to come back later in the B part. All right, so the two themes we have, here's the A part theme. Here's the B part theme. Let's listen to the tune and see if we can play those themes when they come up. 1, 2, here's the first one. Then we've got the arpeggios, the theme again, scale, theme, arpeggios, theme, scale, B part theme. Oh, we haven't got this part yet, but here comes the theme again. Scale, theme. Oh, it changes at the end. Cool, so we're getting more of the tune. And if you haven't had a chance to kind of catch up with all of this and keep up with all the different ideas here, that is okay. Let's play through the tune a few times and see if you can start to use some of this. So see if you can start to look for the scales, look for the arpeggio part, and look for those A part themes and B part themes. So here we go from the top. 1, 2, 3, 4. One more time. Okay, so hopefully you're getting a few of those phrases now. I'm going to move on to something that's probably a little bit less formulaic. So those are a few kind of tips and tricks, but then as far as sort of the overall approach, once you've got some of those phrases, you're going to try and just add on a little bit at either side. You might try and hang on a little bit further than that one little phrase you have and experiment. Use some trial and error with your left hand just to experiment to find the next few notes in the tune. You might think about just, is it going up or is it going down? Think about sort of the general arc of what happens right after one of the phrases that you already have learned. And so you're just going to kind of follow that a little bit. Sometimes when I first went to Irish sessions, I would kind of just think like, I would just noodle around a little bit quietly and see if I could find, I would just be like, oh, it's going up higher. So I'd experiment with some notes on the higher strings. Then, oh, it's going lower. And I'd just experiment with notes on the lower strings. As simple as that sounds, trial and error is really helpful. So let's listen through the tune again. And now that we've got those phrases that are like the scales, arpeggios, the themes, let's try holding on a little longer and experimenting to find a few of the notes beyond those parts. So here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. Theme. Arpeggios. Oh, there's a roll in there. Roll. So maybe you got a few more of those notes. Sometimes I was noticing that themes that we already learned, they pop up in like a slightly different way later in the tune. So there might be a series of notes that we learned as a theme, but they might happen and then end a different way later in the tune. So you kind of can start to notice those little similarities between parts of a tune. So there you go. So then trial and error, I have to say, one of the key things with trial and error in a session setting is you do want to be pretty quiet. And I guess it does depend on the session. Some sessions are learning sessions where basically, people are learning tunes in sort of a slow session style. And that just means they're playing the tune a million times and you're doing exactly what we're doing right now, finding those phrases. And in those cases, you can probably kind of noodle around with complete immunity, but often you're gonna have to be really quiet. And here are just some little practical tips for that. I tend, if I'm trying to learn a tune in a session, I will try and play. I'll just play as quietly as I can so that I might be able to hear myself, but maybe the person next to me doesn't really. So I could play towards the tip of my bow, it's a little quieter, over the fingerboard is a little quieter. I'm not trying to make a full sound. I'm not going to try and figure out the tune. I'm really trying to just kind of gingerly figure out the tune. And then if you have phrases that you know, you can go ahead and make those nice and bold. So you might be not sure about this part, but you might be sure about this part. And you can just dive right in full strength for that part. One other tip I have is to listen to a tune at least once all the way through without playing at all. Just really actively listen to the tune the first time. Some people will just be like, okay, I'm gonna dive right in, I'm gonna try and learn this tune right off the bat, but really it helps to get that overall arc of the tune. Is the A part lower down and on the, maybe on the G and the D strings? Is the B part then higher up? And then you kind of have this overall big picture and you can start to fill in the details. But it's really good to listen to a tune first, even sort of start to hum it a little bit in your head as you listen. So those are all some good ways to learn in a session setting in a sort of unobtrusive way. One other little tip that I have from my early session years is try keeping your bow moving, even if your left hand isn't figuring everything out quite yet. And this might be something that takes a little tiny bit of practice, but I have found that there's a lot of focus on we're learning what the fingers are doing over here. We're learning the left hand, when really you can also be working on, you can also be figuring out the rhythm of the tune. Usually it's easier to figure out the rhythm of the tune than the notes. So as you're listening, you might be able to go, you might be able to figure out just what the rhythm is, even if you're not playing exactly the right notes. So I started to do that in session settings once I realized that the rhythm was equally as important as the left hand, as the melody. One last sort of tip as far as learning by ear that I have found really helpful is to bring a recorder, a voice recorder, or use voice memos on your phone. And this is great because you can record a tune being played through at a session, 5 or 6 or 7 times, however many times they're playing it. Then you can bring it home and you can practice session style learning in your house and learn a whole bunch of new tunes that way. But you're getting more familiar with learning those tunes by ear. So what I will do is I will actually get that recording. I'll plug my headphones in. I don't have fancy Bluetooth headphones. These are, I guess, a little fancy, but so what I do is I put on my headphones, but I leave one side off just a little bit so I can hear myself, but I can also hear the recording really well. It's harder to do this without headphones because it's just hard to get it loud enough so that you really feel like you're at the session and you're practicing learning by ear. But I'll put the headphones on, one of them a little bit off, and then I will just play along and practice session learning that way. And it does honestly feel a little bit like you're still in the thick of it. Not quite the same, but especially in COVID times, this is a really good way to be practicing learning by ear. And I'll give you some tips at the end as to how you can be practicing for sessions even right now, because obviously the best way to practice playing at sessions is to go to sessions, which we cannot do. But there are ways to listen to session style playing and practice that from home so that when we're allowed, you can just dive right back into the world of Irish music, social Irish music. All right, so I'm gonna play the tune 5 times. This is so you have a real chance to do all the trial and error you want. And I do recommend, if you have them, sticking on some headphones so that you can really hear it well. And I'll just play the tune a bunch of times, see if you can pick it up by ear. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. hope that you picked up a little bit more of the tune, maybe got the whole thing by the end. In case you didn't, it's a tune called Miss Galvin's, Galvin''S. So if you look that up, you can find it and learn it. Yeah, it's a great thing to keep practicing picking these things up by ear, just learning them in the context of hearing them a bazillion times. All right, so I'm gonna play another tune for you all, and this time I'm just gonna let you try applying some of those tips and tricks to learning this tune. So we talked about a few different things: finding the key, looking for scales and stepwise motion, looking for arpeggios, looking for themes at the beginning of the A part and beginning of the B part that will come up again later in the tune, using trial and error to build on those phrases a little bit, and definitely the first thing is just listen through the entire tune without playing so that you get a sense of how it sounds overall. So here's the tune. I'm going to play it a bunch of times. We'll see how many times. It's called the Dunmore Lasses. 1, 2, 3, 4. different phrases in that tune. I won't go into too much detail, but of course it starts out with a little scale here. It's in E minor, you might have found that. So there's that. It starts out with a phrase that of course comes back. You got this again. Then again. And then it ends with something a little bit different. And in the B part, you have a repeating phrase at the beginning of every, at the beginning of the B part, and then at the beginning of every phrase. And then. So if you get just the beginning of the B part, then you have a phrase that recurs a whole lot. Anyway, so I hope all of that makes things a little bit easier to pick up just by listening. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some other aspects of Irish sessions, sort of the etiquette side of things, various conventions. I hope this doesn't get too lecture-y, but I think it's really helpful sometimes to know kind of what you're getting yourself into, because there are some unwritten rules at sessions, or at least expectations. One of the first things is, like, if you go to a new session, how do you kind of get in? And it depends on how open the session is. Sometimes they'll actually advertise online or wherever they're advertising open session. But if they don't, one of the things that I've done, I will freely admit, is I walk in carrying my instrument case very conspicuously and kind of place it somewhere visible nearby and sit with it and sort of like use puppy eyes and hope that somebody notices me and takes pity on me and says, "Hey, do you want to play?" Usually they do. Sometimes they don't. If they don't, usually that's just a good opportunity to listen to other people play and pick up some tunes and just enjoy the music. But generally you do kind of want to be invited to play. You want to wait to be invited, or you can ask somebody who's clearly the host, like, is this an open session? Is it okay if I play? And it'll be pretty straightforward with you. Hosts of sessions are chosen to be people who are going to be pretty straightforward. Then once you're in the session, especially if you're new, you want to wait to be asked to start a medley. So, you know, if you've been going to the session for a really long time, generally you can just dive right in if you want to with your own tunes, but usually I like to wait to be asked. And this is kind of a funny thing. I hope this isn't too manipulative, but I do sometimes, if I want to play a tune, I'll just like start noodling around a little bit during the breaks, and I'll just be like playing the beginning little part of my tune. Usually people pick that up as like a, oh hey, maybe you have a tune you'd like to play, and they might invite you. So, you know, you can try that if you want, if you have a tune you're really itching to play. The other thing to do is to really listen carefully and see how many times through tunes are being played. So a lot of the time at sessions, you kind of start to get a sense of, you know, these are like medleys where they're playing 3 or 4 or 5 times through a tune. In Irish sessions, usually they don't play a tune a million times. In old time sessions, they might play it almost literally a million times, but not in the Irish sessions. So you kind of get a sense of like how many times through-ish are people playing their tunes? How long are the medleys? Are they putting together collections of 2 different tunes, or are they doing 3 different tunes? It's pretty standard to do 3 in an Irish session, but it's not always the case. Sometimes there are sessions where the convention is more to do 1. So it's good to sit back and sort of listen a little bit and get a better sense of, you know, what's the standard here? Like, what are people mostly doing? I actually have notes, so I'm actually looking at my notes right now. I feel extremely prepared. As far as making medleys, so we just discussed the idea that you can listen and see like how many tunes are in a medley in this session. That is sort of a whole other workshop, but I would love to talk a little bit about that right now. Medleys in Irish sessions, you're usually looking at the same type of tune for an entire medley. So for example, you're going to want to play jig, 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 rather than, slip jig, jig, reel. That sort of thing is like usually reserved for kind of performance-y situations where you're changing the time signature. Usually you're going to keep it to the same time signature for tunes. And also, you're going to keep the same time signature, but often people will switch keys. That's kind of standard. Usually you won't play a whole bunch of tunes in the same key at an Irish session. Completely different story at a Cape Breton session. But at an Irish session, you are going to play usually different keys. So if you're looking to put together a medley, what I'd recommend is trying at home a few different collections of your favorite tunes. So if you have a few favorite reels, let's say the Silver Spear, Cold Frosty Morning, and The Wind That Shakes the Barley. You're going to have to think about like, okay, what order am I going to put those in? And try practicing transitions, because honestly, one of the biggest challenges in making medleys is just getting the first few notes of the new tune after you just played the older tune. So you want to kind of listen and practice that. Just practice getting kind of that on the on-ramp into the next tune, because so many of my early Irish sessions, I would try to transition into a new tune and very, very often fall a little bit flat on my face. Thankfully, people were very nice, but it's not always the case. So say you've got Silver Spear, Cold Frosty Morning, and Wind That Shakes the Barley. I'm going to think about where does each tune end, and then where does the next tune begin. So you kind of want to look for tunes where one of them ends in sort of the same area that the next tune begins. So for example, we might want to start with the Silver Spear. Let's see. So how does this end? Ends on an open A. Cold Frosty Morning starts just a few notes below that. So that might be a nice transition. And then where does Cold Frosty Morning end? Ends on an A. Wind That Shakes the Barley starts on an A. So here's a typical medley you might hear at an Irish session. Just putting those all together would probably sound pretty good. pretty decent medley. I'm glad that worked out. Just a little seat in my pants. So one other thing there is when you're switching between tunes, you want to indicate to everybody else that you're switching tunes. So I will often I've had to work on my like sort of bold voice here, but I'll often go hup like that. And it can be a little startling, but that's the goal. So then people can hear it over the melee, and they'll know you're about to switch tunes. They're all gonna drop out, and you're gonna start the next tune. So it's a good thing to be really bold about that, so that everybody knows what's happening. Another thing you can do, if people's feet are visible, which mine are not right now, you can kind of give a little kick, and that also indicates that there's gonna be a switch. Sometimes people will even just like look around the circle while they're playing. They'll be like, and just sort of indicate in that way that we're about to make a change here. So there are all of those different things. You probably wouldn't yell, "Here we go," like I did. That was a little bit of a breach of session etiquette. One does not do that. Another thing to avoid, you don't want to do any sort of really wild improv at an Irish session. So for example, if you're playing the Silver Spear, you might not want to go, so the tune goes like this. You might not want to go. That's a little wild for an Irish session. Usually at Irish sessions, you're going to be looking at some little nuanced ornamentation, or maybe some slight difference in the way you approach the bowing. Generally, you may be adding some double stops, that kind of a thing. But you're generally not going to fly completely off the rails and do anything too dreadfully wild with improvisation. We leave that to the bluegrass musicians. Another thing to do, make sure that you're quiet during songs. So often at Irish sessions, or I shouldn't say often, but upon occasion, somebody will ask for a song, and songs are most often unaccompanied. Sometimes they are accompanied, but most often unaccompanied, and you want to be completely quiet because just a solo voice is really hard to hear. So just being respectful of that. And depending on the session, there might be no songs or there might be tons of songs. So that's another thing that you kind of gauge just by sitting back and listening and seeing what's happening. One last piece of session etiquette in an Irish session, you really need to make sure that you're only playing Irish tunes. And this is something that is actually less strictly followed in Ireland, but there's something of a focus on being pure drop Irish at Irish sessions in the US, and that is, kind of to preserve the tradition. Various sessions are a little more open than that. I think it's great to have both, honestly, because we can get the best of both worlds. But a lot of sessions are going to be just Irish tunes, and so it's good to know whether the tunes you're bringing to the session are actually Irish. Cold Frosty Morning, as it happens, I believe it has Irish origins, but it has been sort of subsumed into other traditions, and so it's actually less Irish now. So I was just thinking as I was playing it, I was like, that's not the most typical Irish session tune, I suppose, but it's still a good one, so I threw it in there anyway. If you're looking for really good resources for session tunes, one of the best places to go is thesession.org. Thesession.org has just tons and tons and tons of sheet music and MIDI files for the sheet music, so you can go on there and you can search for almost any Irish tune and you're going to find it. And also people have often comments down below where they talk about where the tune came from, all that sort of thing. One of the things that I did, here's a little pro tip, is I went on once and I went to tunes and then I clicked on popular tunes, and they have a list of tunes by popularity, like the most popular tune going down. And so I tried for a while just learning from the most popular tunes going down the list, because then I knew that if I were in an Irish session like across the planet somewhere, I might know kind of the core tunes, that the most common tunes that everybody shares. And it's nice to know those. There's also something called Foin Session. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's Foinn, and then session Seision. And they've produced 3 different books of traditional session tunes. They're arranged in medleys, so they've done a lot of the work for you, which is pretty nice. And you can also go on Spotify and you can listen to entire albums of theirs. So I have to say, you know, it does sound like a session. There's a little bit of a messy sort of grassrootsy quality to it, but it's great. They're all great session tunes, and that's a good way that you can, you know, put on headphones at home and learn tunes in a session style, even though we can't really be doing that in person at the moment. So I highly recommend Foin Session, thesession.org. There are a whole bunch of other websites out there. There's TuneArc, the Tune Archive, Traditional Tune Archive. Just a lot of different websites that have tons of tunes, but I have to say thesession.org, good place to go. All right, so I'm going to wrap up by playing a few more tunes slow session style so that you guys can get in a little extra practice on the learning by ear in a session style setting. And if you have any questions about anything today, feel free to drop me a line. Here's my email right here, and I'm glad to answer any questions that you might have. So yeah, be in touch. Again, my name's Liz Faiella. I'm from New Hampshire. I teach fiddle lessons and I perform a good deal with my brother Dan. Dan is also teaching guitar at Virtual MFC. And if you are interested in hearing any of our music, it's lizanddanmusic.com. So, all right, a few tunes to send you on your way. I'm just gonna play a few reels nice and slow, and you can see if you can pick them up. All right, nice to spend an hour with you guys. 1, 2, 3, 4. This next one I'm going to play is called Father Kelly's, and it includes some arpeggios, so look out for those. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Alright you guys, have an awesome time with the rest of virtual MFC, and I can't wait until the next main fiddle camp when we can all be together again. Take care guys.